Hey everyone, this is Jake Murray, and in this video I'm going to go about showing you how I add texture to a grayscale sketch. So in Painter 12 I've created a quick tonal sketch starting with a simple line drawing and adding grayscale values over top of it with a soft airbrush. I intentionally avoid any texture at this point because it's more important to make sure my values are correct and the larger forms of my painting are reading. But once I have all these forms established, I can think about what surface textures I can apply to them. I personally prefer to paint my textures by hand using either textured brushes in Photoshop or various textured papers in Painter. The great thing about Painter is that once you set your paper texture in the Papers palette, any brush that has the grain feature enabled will take on that particular texture. So you can get a lot of variety by combining different papers with different brush settings. So now that I've chosen what particular brush and paper setting I want to use, I'll start refining the textures of objects by hand. As I said, this is just a personal preference that comes from years of doing detailed graphite drawings. But the important thing to realize, no matter how you go about adding texture to a piece, is that all texture is essentially form. And the only reason we see a particular surface texture is because of the way that surface interacts with the light hitting it, just like all larger forms. So when I'm adding textures to objects, I'm always thinking about form on a micro scale. I know that a particular surface may need to be rocky or furry, or in the case of these foreground bushes, more organic and like piney. But I'm also considering how that rockiness or fuzziness will look under the given lighting conditions. Since the lighting in this piece is coming more from the upper right, I know that any little surface bump is going to have a lighter right side and a darker left side, just following the principles of a lit form. Another reason to keep that in mind, especially when using texture brushes or overlays, is that it means that one particular textured brush may not work for every painting situation. What I mean by that is you may have a particular like grassy texture brush or like a rocky brush or something like that that works perfectly with the lighting in one painting, and then you use it in another painting where the lighting is different and it just looks completely wrong and completely out of place. So when choosing your texture brushes and papers, keep in mind whether or not that particular texture is going to work harmoniously with the lighting of your piece. I've found that a lot of times I'll use a particular textured brush that maybe is kind of unexpected for an object. You know, maybe a wood grain brush, a particular wood grain brush or something works great for grass or something other than wood. So don't necessarily let what the object you're painting is dictate what texture brush you should be using. Here you can see I'm just adding some basic overall texture to the dirt road using a rocky paper texture. This gives me a nice, somewhat random base to work on top of when I go back in to paint some of the larger textural forms. When it comes to painting textures by hand, it's also important to consider the quality of your strokes. It's really tempting to just start scribbling away without much thought, but you really need to consider how the direction and the weight of your paint strokes is conveying the texture you're going for. This awareness really just comes from practice and drawing still lifes of differently textured objects. And the more you do it, the more conveying a particular texture will just become muscle memory, and you can just kind of do it without much thought, but it won't look thoughtless when you do it. When starting with a value sketch like I've done here, another option for introducing texture is with overlays or painting on a multiply layer above your value scheme layers. You can do this in either Painter or Photoshop, and it's a good way to get a base texture down quickly, but not really for final details because it'll usually tend to look off if you just leave it. So if you do use texture overlays, I would recommend painting details by hand over top of them, just to keep your painting from looking too much like a collage, unless that's the look you're going for. Also, multiply layers will inevitably affect the value tones of your painting, so you'll need to be careful and adjust them so that you don't end up accidentally throwing off the whole tonal plan. It's that reason that I don't really prefer to use them. I would rather just have a solid tonal plan in place and then just color pick values from that to paint with by hand. Then I know that no matter how detailed or textured I get with my painting, the overall image will still read just as well as when I started. So now I'm starting to work out some of that grass texture there in the background. And with grass in particular, it's always tempting to just want to sort of scribble these vertical strokes over the whole thing, because that's kind of how we see grass. But in actuality, I'm thinking about tufts of grass, the little clumps of grass and how they fit together. And that helps to kind of randomize some of the texture and vary up some of the shaping within that texture. Another rule of thumb for working with textures is that they are most apparent in the areas on a form where the light transitions towards the core shadow. Areas of shadow typically show less texture because there's just simply less light interacting with those surfaces. So you may notice as I go along here that I'm not evenly texturing every area, mostly just the areas in the light or halftones of my larger forms. Also, the textures of objects should change throughout a piece. And what I mean by this, for example, is that the texture of the grass in the foreground is not going to be the same as the texture of the grass in the background, because as it gets further away from the viewer, there's less visual detail that they can pick up on. So generally, as anything recedes into the background, there should be less defined texture. But then sometimes in the background, your larger forms, if it's like a repeating pattern or something, can ultimately become sort of a texture of their own. So it's just kind of interesting little things to notice as you're looking around. at other paintings or at life, landscapes, anything like that, notice how larger forms can suddenly become textures of their own when pushed way back into the background. And here I'm just working out some of that wood grain texture on these wooden fence posts with just, at least on the vertical beams, keeping the strokes vertical to indicate that grain, and then on the horizontal beams, keeping the grain horizontal. It's pretty basic stuff, but it always just good to kind of think of if it's not just sort of ingrained in your memory. So now as I'm getting into painting over the barn there in the background, there's another example here of how texture in a painting sort of changes from foreground to background. At this point, since the barn is in the background, I'm not worried about giving each little plank, each little wooden beam, a wood grain texture, because it's so far back in the background that we really wouldn't see that so much. What the texture of the barn is really is the pattern created by the planks side by side, which is similar to what a wood grain texture would look like, but it's in itself, it's a very different texture, and it's created by different things. So now I'm starting to get into the robot here, and really, the robot's going to be pretty easy because his texture is essentially what was already there. He's shiny, he's metallic, and you're not going to see a whole lot of surface bumps on that. Now, I'm going to get into putting some in there just to kind of show a little bit of wear and tear on him. Little nicks and scratches and tiny little dents. But overall, his lack of texture is sort of his texture. Shininess and smoothness, that is a texture. And it really takes just as much consideration with those surfaces as anything that's bumpy or grainy or hairy or anything like that. It's just knowing how to convey those surfaces. The important thing with shiny or metallic surfaces, as far as painting their texture, is to make sure you add those little specular highlights, those bright white spots in the middle of the light side of the form. And that really just conveys the smoothness and the reflectivity of the surface, which is essentially its texture. Here I think you can see a little bit. Well, not just yet, but I'll be adding scratches in a very particular way. So I'm not sure if you can quite see it in the video here, but I'm adding scratches in kind of a circular spiral motion around that highlight, and it kind of gives it that sort of brushed aluminum look that you kind of see on pots and pans in the kitchen or anything else like that. Is if you really pay attention and look closely, the scratches on them aren't, while they're random, they follow a particular pattern, this particular circular pattern. And if you can sort of pay attention to little details like that in the world and from life and incorporate those into your paintings, it's just that much more detail and interest that you can achieve with them. At this point we're getting pretty close to the end and just refining last details and taking a look at it and making sure that everything still fits the original vision I had for the sketch or the painting. And I think everything's looking pretty good. So here's it without texture and with texture, and it's all done by hand. But I want to thank you guys for watching. I hope it helped, and check out more of my work over at my website, murart.com. Thanks.